Have you ever wondered where you really stand with God? Are you overcome with feelings of guilt because of things you've done wrong? Are you tired of religion that focuses on rules that you can't keep? Have we got good news for you? It's time to listen in on some casual conversation with Mike Kapler and Joel Brueseke and discover what true freedom is all about. This is Growing in Grace.
Howdy doody-doo to you and yours. I'm Mike, along with Joel. And you lucky geezer, you just discovered, are you ready for it? The Growing in Grace podcast. No, I'm serious. I kid you not. The Growing in Grace podcast, you found us. And now it's your job to share it with somebody else. Don't hoard it. Don't keep a good thing to yourself. How are you doing this week, Joel?
Well, all I can say is howdy doody and geezer. Are you showing your age there at all?
You know, sometimes you don't think ahead, and that's just what comes out.
It's just what comes out. I know. I've started many a podcast like that myself. It's not like I sit there for hours and think, all right, what's my first word's going to be?
Yeah, I can guarantee you I did not do that, where I meditated, and God gave me the word geezer.
Well, I'm just a geezer for the Lord.
A young geezer.
You know, you're as young as you think. You and I, Cap, we've talked about this before, not on the podcast, I don't think, but and we'll get into what we're going to talk about here. But the idea that, yes, our bodies are getting older, but on the inside, you and me, we both feel young. You know, our bodies know that we're not young, not as young as we used to be, but you still kind of just have that childish, or I don't know if it's childish or childlike, whatever you want to call it. Just qualities and thoughts, but the body sure does age, but doesn't mean your mind has to, I guess.
No, and sometimes people confuse the organ of the brain with the mind, and I don't think they're the same thing at all, right? Because they do function differently. So, you know, things that happen in your older years, sometimes you don't remember as well, and obviously there's things out there like Alzheimer's, and that's not necessarily the mind. The Bible talks about the mind, but you're right. I think it was the Apostle Paul who said, inwardly, we're being renewed day by day.
Yeah.
So bodies age. Technically, I'm not sure that we do as spirit beings, but
right.
there may be a different kind of aging that's even outside the parameters of time, with a maturity and so forth. So I think probably the best definition for us out of those that you just gave would be childish and not childlike. But that's just you. That's you and me. I mean,
yeah, I agree.
We're childish, and we admit it.
And people who listen to our podcast probably recognize it too in us from time to time. Anyway,
that's all right.
But yeah,
I got no problem with it.
I still think that we're in God's will. No.
Well, let's talk about that. I'm trying to decide how to intersect several roads here. So
right.
Maybe we'll do that this week and next. I don't know. God's will. All right, hold that thought, because somebody had written to us and said, one thing that would be cool for you guys to talk about is, how does grace work? How is it applied in our everyday lives? And they went on to give a couple of examples of things that they might do just as a normal, regular, everyday activity, like waiting in line for something, or shopping at the grocery store, or, you know, name your thing. Maybe you're cleaning house or doing some yard work or doing your job. How do we live in this grace thing just in normal everyday life without all the spiritual stuff that we often talk about, even here on the program?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, the way you said something there, I'm not even sure what you just said, but it reminded me of something. Let's talk about the mind and the brain. But anyway, not being able to remember what you just said, but it sparked something into me that, and now I just forgot. Well, just maybe it'll come back to me later on.
Oh, don't leave me hanging.
Well, it had to do with how we live our lives, our daily lives. I remember what it was now. Back on track here. Like, a lot of people will see me on Facebook, and I write a lot of what people would call spiritual stuff. One of my old friends from high school, she, a few years ago, friended me on Facebook, And right away, one of her first questions she asked me is, "When did you get so religious?" And the thing that I said back was, I'm not religious. And some of my other Facebook friends said Joel is the least religious person that you would ever know, because they understand what I mean by religious. I might talk a lot or write a lot about Jesus and about grace and about things that have to do with life in Christ. But when a person sees me in everyday life, a lot of people, just by the way that I live, they wouldn't necessarily know, apart from me talking about Christ, but a lot of people like that I work with, I just am who I am in Christ without needing the words to do it. And so what I'm saying is that in Christianity, there's a lot of religious jargon. There's a lot of things that people think that they need to say when they're talking with other people. And nothing wrong with evangelism. We want to share Christ with people. We want people to come to know Jesus. But some of these things, like in everyday life, I used to, as an early legalistic Christian in my early life, I thought that I had to go share Jesus with everybody I knew, and I would feel guilty if I didn't do that. But now, standing in the grocery line, usually what I'm doing is I'm thinking about how much is this going to cost and how quickly can I get out of the store. I mean, it's not a big religious life that I have. But yet, inside me 24/7, there is just this sense, there is this knowing of who I am in Christ. And sometimes when I drive for a living, sometimes when I drive, the people around me, and most people can relate to this, sometimes other drivers make you happy, sometimes other drivers make you not so happy, and sometimes you respond in not so happy ways. But over time, grace has changed how I respond. Not that I do this perfectly all the time, but I mean, I've realized I need grace. Everybody needs grace. And so in a lot of ways, how I interact with other drivers has changed. So that's how grace has affected my life. That's how it's lived out in my life. And it's ever changing. The cool thing about life in Christ is that it's not stagnant, but we're always changing, always growing, always learning, and getting to know God more and more.
Yeah. It's always going to be a growing process. And I think this is something I've thought about over the years. How do you carry grace throughout your everyday life? Well, for me, I can relate to everything you just said. Look, I go through life. We do our daily activities. We do our weekly activities. Whatever is going on. I still love sports. I like to watch movies and classic TV shows, and I like, I'll talk politics, and, there's just things, that we do, whether you're at work or play. Sometimes you're just thinking about what you're doing. But I have found over the years, sometimes even in the midst of just an everyday activity, and I think maybe, and you could certainly relate to this, Joel, when I'm alone, if I were driving in the car, that would be a good time where you stop and you kind of, take inventory, so to speak, and realize this tremendous gift of grace and righteousness that has been poured out upon us through God's Son, Jesus Christ. And I stop and think about that, and I compare it to how I used to live in the Christian life, which was a lot of effort and a lot of trying and a lot of attempts to make myself right with God and trying to do enough. You were talking about, sharing the gospel with a lot of people. That's a good thing. Mm-hmm. But I felt forced to do it. I felt the pressure to do it. I felt required to do it. And if I didn't follow through on some of those religious activities, again, some of them being good ones, I just felt like I didn't know where I stood with God. And that went on for about 20 years until I came into grace. And now over the last 20 years, compared to the first 20, I'm just constantly, regardless of where I'm at, what I'm doing, or even what I'm thinking about, I am constantly in this state of peace and tranquility, because I realize it's no longer up to me. This thing that we call Christianity, it's not up to me to try to maintain some certain level to achieve acceptance from God. That's been taken care of. This truly is a finished work of Jesus Christ. And so when I began to realize that I couldn't make God love me more, there was nothing I could do to make him love me less, that changed everything for me. And so now I'm just going through the day, and I think periodically, at least, I stop and just think about that. And I just think about how cool this is. And Joel, we were talking before we came on the podcast that a lot of the things I used to do, again, some of them being, things that I'm not trying to discourage in the lives of believers, but my motivations and stuff maybe were a little bit misaligned because I didn't understand that finished work. And so I spent a lot more time doing Christian stuff, religious stuff. I went to church more. Several times a week I was there. We worked with, young adult ministry. We went door to door. We went to the college witnessing. I spent a lot more time trying to read as many chapters of the Bible as possible within a day. I spent a lot more time during the course of the week trying to spend more time in this formal thing called prayer, and seeing how long I could pray. And now, and I've asked God about this before, now I spend less time in prayer than what I used to before I came into an understanding of grace, at least in the sense that we think of prayer. Because sometimes I feel like I'm in a constant state of prayer, even when I'm doing all these other things in our daily lives. In fact, Joel, I've spent hours asking God why I don't pray more. Just kidding. But no, I have had that discussion with the Lord. And Lord, I don't understand why I used to just try so hard to spend as much time in prayer as I could, and now I don't do it as much anymore. Should I be concerned? And the answer that came back eventually was, you're okay, just because I'm in a fellowship that it goes beyond that kind of thinking. It goes beyond this formal thing that we call prayer. I'm not discouraging prayer. I just think it happens differently for me than what it used to. And I know we're getting close to the end here, and there's plenty more to say about all of this. But.
Right. I think next week we can pick up on some of this, because this idea of one thing I'd like to talk about, this idea of being in God's will, wanting to make, that was always one of my things, was making sure I'm in God's will. And I never knew if I was in God's will or not. No matter what choice I made, I was always second guessing myself. And was that really of God? Was that not of God? And I finally, I came to this place where I am now, where I'm in God's will. I'm never out of God's will. I'm always in God's will, because God's will is that we are in Christ. And in Christ, the goal isn't trying to figure out what to do all the time. The goal is to know God, to be known by Him, to know Him. And that's really what life in Christ is about. And life is full of all kinds of choices, and God's not a puppeteer. So we can talk about some of that stuff, maybe a few other things as well, along this whole line of living out grace in our daily lives. So we'll pick up on this next week, right here on Growing in Grace.
This has been Growing in Grace with Mike Kapler and Joel Brueseke, heard online through various internet sources around the world each week. To access hundreds of past programs, visit graceroots.org. Share it with a friend and listen again next week for more Growing in Grace.